The day I signed the papers for my first home, the one I'd worked over a decade to afford, should have been the proudest day of my life. But instead, it became the day my own parents turned against me. They didn't congratulate me. They didn't even visit. Instead, they demanded I hand the house over to my unemployed sister because, in their words, she needs it more. When I refused, thinking they'd eventually come to their senses, they did something I never imagined. They took me to court. My own flesh and blood was ready to destroy me, all to gift my hard-earned home to someone who never lifted a finger. My name is Lydia, and for as long as I can remember, owning a home was my ultimate dream. Growing up, we never had much. My parents always struggled with money, and we moved from one rented apartment to another. I used to promise myself that one day I'd have a place I could truly call my own. That dream fueled every decision I made. I worked 2 part-time jobs while putting myself through college, skipped vacations when my friends were traveling the world, and saved every extra dollar I could. It took over a decade of sacrifice, but finally the day arrived. I was ready to buy my first home. The house wasn't a mansion, but to me, it was perfect. A little brick cottage with a small garden, a cozy living room, and a kitchen big enough for all the family dinners I'd dreamed of hosting. Signing those papers felt like the universe was finally rewarding me for all the years of hard work and loneliness. When I called my parents to share the news, I expected them to be proud. I expected tears, hugs, maybe even a celebratory dinner. Instead, there was a long, heavy silence, and then my mother said, in a voice colder than I'd ever heard before, "You should have talked to us first." I brushed it off as shock. Maybe they were just surprised. But deep down, a small, uneasy knot started forming in my stomach, one I didn't yet realize would grow into the biggest heartbreak of my life. The day I got the keys, I invited my family to see the house. I pictured smiles, laughter, maybe even a bottle of champagne to celebrate. But when they arrived, the atmosphere was anything but joyful. They walked through the rooms quietly, not commenting on the paint colors or the garden I was so proud of. My mother barely spoke at all, and my father kept muttering things under his breath about priorities and selfish decisions. My younger sister, who hadn't worked in years and still lived with them rent-free, looked around with a smirk that made my stomach twist. Finally, as we stood in the empty living room, my mother spoke. "You know," she said, "this place is much too big for one person. Your sister could really use a home like this." At first, I laughed. I thought she was joking, but when I looked at their faces, I realized she wasn't. They weren't here to celebrate with me. They were here to claim what I had worked for. Over the next few weeks, the conversations became more frequent and more aggressive. My parents would drop hints over dinner about how family supports each other and how it's cruel to watch a sibling struggle when you're doing so well. My sister joined in too, guilt-tripping me with emotional pleas. "I'm trying to get my life together," she'd say. "It's just so hard when I don't have a stable place to live." I reminded them that she was an adult, perfectly capable of finding a job and renting a place like everyone else. But they brushed it off, insisting that it was my duty as the successful daughter to help her. What they meant was clear. They expected me to hand over my house. It wasn't a request. It was a demand wrapped in guilt. I tried to be patient. I tried to explain that this home wasn't just a building. It was the culmination of everything I had worked for. But the more I said no, the more they treated me like a villain. My mother accused me of being heartless. My father said I had forgotten where I came from. My sister called me selfish and ungrateful. The pressure became suffocating. Phone calls, unannounced visits, passive-aggressive messages. It felt like my entire family had turned into a coordinated campaign to break me down. But I refused. I told them clearly, the house was mine. I had earned it, paid for it, and no amount of guilt-tripping would change that. That's when the conversations stopped being manipulative and started becoming threatening. It started with a text from my father. "We can do this the easy way, or the hard way." I stared at the screen, stunned. I didn't know what they meant until a few days later when a letter arrived, a formal notice from a lawyer. My parents were suing me. Their claim? That the money they had given me years ago to help with college was an investment, and they were now seeking repayment, which, according to their lawyer, could be satisfied by transferring ownership of the house to my sister. It was absurd. Illegal even, but it was real. My own parents had hired a lawyer and were prepared to drag me into court over my home. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Friends tried to be supportive, but they couldn't fully understand the pain of being betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. Every meeting with my attorney felt surreal. Every court notice was like a fresh stab to the heart. I wasn't just defending property. I was defending my dignity. My parents painted me as greedy and ungrateful, and my sister posted vague accusations online about selfish siblings who abandon family. I became the villain in their story, and they were determined to make the world believe. And by the time the first court date was scheduled, the emotional toll was overwhelming. Sleep became rare. Meals felt pointless. I questioned everything. Was I being selfish? Had I become the monster they painted me to be? But then I'd stand in the doorway of my home, touch the walls I'd worked so hard for, and remind myself why I couldn't give in. This wasn't just about property. It was about boundaries, respect, and the right to live a life built by my own hands. And if it meant standing alone against the people who raised me, then so be it. The first day of court felt like stepping into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Sitting on one side of the courtroom were my parents and sister, looking solemn and wounded, as though I had betrayed them. On the other side, it was just me and my attorney, a visual reminder of how alone I truly was. Their lawyer wasted no time twisting the narrative. According to them, the financial help they'd offered me for college wasn't a gift, but a family loan, and the understanding was that I'd repay it by supporting my sister when I was financially stable. They even presented fabricated text messages and emails, selective snippets taken out of context, to paint me as someone who'd promised to share my future wealth. I wanted to scream that none of it was true, that I had worked for every cent that bought that house. But the courtroom isn't about emotions. It's about evidence, arguments, and patience. My attorney told me to stay calm, to trust the process. Still, the betrayal cut deeper with every lie they told. It wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about rewriting history, erasing my sacrifices, and turning my independence into something shameful. The legal battle quickly became a smear campaign. My parents' lawyer painted me as a selfish daughter who abandoned family values the moment I achieved success. They dredged up old arguments, exaggerated disagreements, and even accused me of emotionally neglecting my sister. The most painful part was watching my mother cry on the stand, saying things I knew weren't true. "We raised her with everything we had," she sobbed. "And now, when her sister is struggling, she turns her back on us." Their attorney introduced witnesses, family friends, neighbors, even distant relatives, who all repeated the same carefully constructed narrative: that I was cold, greedy, and heartless. I sat silently, fists clenched under the table, while my reputation was shredded in public. It wasn't just about legal tactics. It was psychological warfare. They wanted me humiliated, broken, and desperate enough to hand over the house just to make it stop. But even through the humiliation, one thing became clear. If I surrendered now, I'd spend the rest of my life being manipulated. I had to fight back, not just for my home, but for my dignity. My lawyer and I knew that facts were on our side. Every payment for the house came directly from my bank account. Every tuition payment my parents had made had been documented as a gift, not a loan. We gathered bank statements, emails, and text conversations, a paper trail of truth they couldn't rewrite. When it was my turn to testify, I told the story plainly and calmly, how I'd worked since my teens, how I'd saved relentlessly, how I'd dreamed of owning a home for over a decade. I explained how the house represented my independence, and how my family's sudden claim had blindsided me. We also highlighted my sister's reality. 32, years old, unemployed by choice, and living rent-free with my parents while refusing multiple job offers. The court needed to see that this wasn't about need, it was about entitlement. By the end of the day, I noticed a shift. The judge's questions became sharper, their lawyer's tone more defensive, The tide wasn't turning yet, but for the first time I felt hope. Outside the courtroom, things got worse. My parents stopped speaking to me directly, choosing instead to post cryptic messages online about ungrateful children and betrayal within families. My sister shared photos of her. Difficult living conditions, conveniently staged to make her look homeless, despite still living comfortably at home. Mutual relatives started calling, urging me to just give her the house to keep the peace. Some accused me of being obsessed with money. Others said I'd changed and forgotten family. Each message felt like a dagger. These were people who had once celebrated my achievements. Now they saw me as the villain. It was isolating and exhausting. But beneath the loneliness, there was a growing fire. I realized they were afraid. If they were confident about their case, they wouldn't need to manipulate public opinion. They were losing control, and they knew it. As the trial continued, contradictions began to surface. Their claim about a family loan fell apart under questioning when my father admitted there was never a written agreement. My mother's testimony shifted multiple times, contradicting itself under pressure. Then came the most damaging revelation. My sister, who had sworn she needed a home, was secretly listed as a co-applicant on another property just months earlier, one she'd been denied due to lack of income. It destroyed their narrative of desperation. The judge's tone changed dramatically. What had started as a case of family misunderstanding was beginning to look like manipulation and greed. My attorney leaned over and whispered, "We're winning this." But I didn't feel victorious, not yet. Because I knew my parents weren't done. If they couldn't win in court, they'd find another way to hurt me, and they did. One night, I came home to find the locks on my front door tampered with. Inside, drawers were open, documents scattered. Nothing was stolen, except for a folder of financial papers related to the house purchase. I called the police, but I didn't have proof of who had done it. Still, I knew in my gut who was responsible. And if that wasn't enough, the next morning I received an anonymous letter in my mailbox. "You'll lose more than a house if you don't give up." The message was clear. They were trying to scare me into surrendering. But fear turned into fury. If they wanted war, I was done playing defense. It was time to strike back with everything I had. With my lawyer's help, we filed a counterclaim for harassment and defamation, presenting evidence of the social media smear campaign, the staged photos, and the false accusations. We also provided the court with a report of the break-in and the threatening letter. The shift in the courtroom was immediate. The judge's patience with their theatrics vanished. Suddenly, they were on the defensive, scrambling to justify their actions and backpedaling on claims they'd once shouted confidently. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt powerful again. The house wasn't just a symbol of my independence anymore. It was now the battlefield where I would reclaim my voice, my boundaries, and my peace. And as the next phase of the trial approached, I made a silent promise to myself. They might have started this war, but I would be the one to end it. The day the harassment reached my workplace was the day something inside me snapped. A colleague forwarded me a message from an unknown account, accusing me of being a family thief and warning my company that I couldn't be trusted. It was humiliating, but more than that, it was a declaration of war. I went into the bathroom, locked the stall, and let myself cry, not from weakness, but from rage. Everything I'd built, my career, my independence, my peace, was under attack because I had dared to build a life for myself. That night, I sat alone in the house they wanted so badly and made a decision. I would stop reacting and start acting. They had crossed every line, and now it was my turn to draw one. But this wasn't going to be petty revenge. No. I was going to end their manipulation in a way that would make them regret ever trying to control me. And for that, I needed a plan. One that was as strategic as it was devastating. The first step was strengthening my legal defenses. I met with my lawyer and laid everything on the table: the harassment, the online defamation, the threats, and the break-in. Together we started building a legal fortress around me. We filed restraining orders, expanded the counterclaim to include damages for emotional distress, and requested subpoenas for phone and internet records connected to the harassment. If they wanted a fight in court, I was going to make it one they couldn't win. At the same time, we prepared for the possibility that they might try new tactics, like claiming I was financially obligated to support them. So, I documented every cent I'd spent, every instance of support I'd already given over the years. The goal was simple: eliminate every loophole they could exploit. For the first time in months, I felt like I was regaining control. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about building an airtight case that would expose the truth once and for all. The next phase of the plan was harder. I had to disappear from their narrative. Until now, every message they sent, every insult, every guilt trip, had gotten a reaction from me. Not anymore. I stopped responding to texts, blocked their numbers, and avoided family events. I removed them from social media entirely. I became a ghost in their lives. At first, they doubled down, sending long, furious emails and posting passive-aggressive rants online. But without my reactions to fuel them, their attacks lost power. They were shouting into the void, and it frustrated them more than anything I could have said. Meanwhile, I watched quietly as their own behavior began to damage their case. Their harassment continued, which only strengthened my legal claims. Relatives who had once sided with them began distancing themselves, uncomfortable with how obsessed they had become. Silence, I realized, was a weapon, and I was wielding it well. While the legal process moved forward, I began gathering evidence they didn't know I had. Old messages, voice notes, and emails from years back, where they openly admitted they had no claim to my money or property, were archived and organized. Even more damning were the voice recordings I'd started collecting recently. Conversations where they threatened to make my life hell unless I handed over the house, and one where my sister admitted the lawsuit was just a way to get what's ours. All of it was time-stamped, verified, and ready to be submitted to the court. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was preparing to dismantle their credibility so completely that they would never dare to challenge me again. As I fortified my defenses, I also started preparing for life after this war. I met with a financial advisor to restructure my assets, placing the house and other properties into a trust they could never touch. I updated my will and appointed a trusted friend as my power of attorney, cutting them out of every possible decision about my estate. I even spoke to a therapist, determined to heal the scars their betrayal had left behind. Because the truth was, no matter how the case ended, I didn't want to carry this pain forever. I wanted freedom, not just from their demands, but from the hold they'd had over my emotions. For the first time in my life, I was building a future that was truly mine, one they could neither control nor destroy. With the case nearing its final phase, I set the final part of my plan into motion, a legal trap they wouldn't see coming. Through my lawyer, we offered a settlement. I would agree to a modest financial contribution to my sister if, and only if, they dropped all claims, issued a formal apology in writing, and admitted under oath that the house belonged solely to me. It was bait, carefully crafted to expose their true intentions. If they were truly after justice, they'd accept, but if it was greed, they'd reject it. And reject it they did, furious that I'd even suggest they admit wrongdoing. That rejection, arrogant and impulsive, became a powerful piece of evidence in my favor. It proved, beyond doubt, that they were motivated not by fairness, but by entitlement. The night before the final court date, I stood in the living room of the house that had caused so much chaos. The silence felt different now, heavier but also stronger. I had done everything I could. The evidence was ironclad, the legal strategy was bulletproof, and my resolve had never been sharper. No matter how ugly tomorrow got, I was ready. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about every insult, every manipulation, every tear they'd caused me to shed. It was about reclaiming my life, and making sure they could never take another piece of it again. Tomorrow, the real confrontation would begin. And this time, I wouldn't just defend myself. I would win. The courtroom felt colder than I expected. The air was heavy, the tension thicker than anything I had ever felt before. As I took my seat beside my attorney, I caught my parents' eyes for the first time in months. They looked furious, self-righteous, as if I had wronged them. My sister sat next to them, dressed in designer clothes she hadn't paid for, looking smug and entitled. The judge entered, and the case that had torn my family apart officially began. Their lawyer painted me as a selfish daughter who had abandoned family obligations and hoarded resources, while my sister struggled. I almost laughed. If it hadn't been so infuriating. When it was our turn, my attorney calmly dismantled their argument with receipts, bank statements, and messages showing years of financial support. Every piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of their case, but the real bombshell came when my lawyer played the audio recording of my sister, admitting the lawsuit was just a way to get what's ours. The courtroom went silent, my parents' faces drained of color. The judge leaned forward, his expression hardening. For the first time, the tide was turning. Day 2 of the trial was worse, for them. Their testimony crumbled under cross-examination. My parents had claimed I'd promised the house to my sister, but when pressed, they couldn't provide a single shred of evidence. They tried to argue that family tradition obligated me to share, but the judge quickly shut that down, reminding them that the law recognizes no such obligation. Then, their lawyer brought up emotional arguments, how they had sacrificed everything for me, how I was ungrateful. But that narrative didn't hold either. We had records of me paying their mortgage during hard times, covering my sister's student loans, and even helping with hospital bills. I had given more than anyone else ever had, and it still wasn't enough. By the end of the day, their credibility was in tatters. The courtroom saw them for what they truly were, manipulators, not victims. Outside the courthouse, tensions exploded. As I was leaving, my mother caught up to me, her face red with rage. "You're destroying this family," she hissed. "Do you really think you'll win? Blood is thicker than water. You owe us." I stared at her, 1,000 emotions running through me. Hurt, anger, disbelief. "I don't owe anyone my life," I said quietly. "And I definitely don't owe you my house." My sister joined in, calling me selfish, heartless, cold. But none of it pierced me anymore. I had spent years carrying guilt that didn't belong to me. That burden was gone now. When I walked away that day, I felt lighter. Their words no longer held power. They were just noise, desperate, bitter noise from people who could no longer control me. The final day of court arrived, and with it, the closing arguments. Their lawyer tried one last emotional plea, portraying my sister as a victim of circumstance and me as a hoarder of privilege. But it was too little, too late. My lawyer delivered a powerful final statement. "This case isn't about generosity. It's about entitlement. The plaintiff's family believes they have a right to property they neither earned nor contributed to, and the defendant is standing up for her legal and moral right to what's hers." When the judge left to deliberate, the courtroom was silent. I held my breath, my hands trembling. Months of pain, humiliation, and betrayal had led to this moment. The judge returned after what felt like an eternity. His decision was short, clear, and final. All claims against the defendant are dismissed. The property in question is solely and legally hers. Furthermore, due to the plaintiff's harassment and malicious intent, they are ordered to pay all legal fees and a portion of damages. I didn't even realize I was crying until I felt the tears hit my hands. It was over. After everything, the threats, the lies, the betrayal, justice had prevailed. My parents looked stunned. My sister stormed out in tears. Not once did any of them look back at me. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was brutal. Extended family members reached out, some apologizing, others siding with my parents. I received messages blaming me for tearing the family apart, but I didn't respond. I focused on rebuilding my life, repainting the house, planting a garden, hosting friends who chose to be in my life. My home felt different now. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of everything I had fought for and won. My parents tried to contact me a few times, but I ignored their calls. I had nothing left to say. If they wanted a relationship, they'd have to come with humility. And even then, forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. One evening, I received a letter. It was from my sister. She wrote that she hated me and hoped I'd enjoy the house alone. I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and walked to the front door. I stood there for a long moment, then gently closed it. That door, the one they had tried so hard to break down, was now mine to protect. The war was over. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was free. The first morning after the verdict felt surreal. For the first time in months, I woke up without the weight of dread pressing down on my chest. The house was quiet, not the suffocating silence of fear, but the comforting hush of peace. I walked through each room slowly, running my fingers along the walls. This place, once tainted with anxiety, now felt like mine again. I brewed coffee, sat on the porch, and let the sunlight wash over me. My phone buzzed with messages, some congratulating me, others condemning me, but I left it inside. Today wasn't for them. It was for me. For so long I'd been fighting to prove my worth, to protect what I had built. But now I was finally living in it. The calls from my parents didn't stop. Some were angry, others pleading, all filled with the same undercurrent, a refusal to accept responsibility. They wanted forgiveness without change, reconciliation without apology. I ignored them. It wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation. When extended family members accused me of being cold, I asked a simple question. If they did this to you, would you forgive them? Silence was always the answer. People loved to preach about family loyalty until betrayal landed on their own doorstep. It wasn't that I didn't love my parents anymore. I just couldn't let that love destroy me again. Without the constant noise of family drama, I discovered something unexpected. Space. Space to breathe, to think, to reconnect with people who truly valued me. Friends I'd neglected during the chaos returned to my life. Colleagues who had watched me crumble under the weight of the lawsuit became allies, inviting me to dinners, encouraging me to travel, reminding me what joy looked like. One evening, surrounded by laughter and clinking glasses, I realized this was the family I had chosen. They weren't bound by blood, but by loyalty, respect, and care. The very things I'd always longed for. I poured myself into transforming the house. Walls were painted, gardens replanted, old memories scrubbed away. Every nail hammered, every flower bed tended was an act of reclaiming. Neighbors began stopping by, complimenting the changes. Some even shared how they'd heard whispers of my court battle and admired my courage. For once, I wasn't being judged. I was being respected. The house wasn't just shelter anymore. It had become a fortress of survival, a testament to endurance. Where others saw bricks and wood, I saw chapters of my story, chapters I had written with my own hands. Word eventually reached me. My sister's life had spiraled. Without the house, without the financial cushion she had expected, she struggled. Jobs slipped through her fingers, relationships crumbled, and debts mounted. A part of me wanted to feel pity, but another part, the part that remembered the betrayal, the threats, the smugness, felt nothing. She had gambled my life's work for her convenience and lost. The difference between us was never luck. It was effort. And effort was something she had always refused to give. Eventually, the calls stopped. Letters trickled to nothing. My parents' silence became its own kind of message. They would never admit they were wrong, and that was fine. I no longer needed their validation. I had built a life outside their approval, and it was stronger, sturdier, freer. Sometimes I caught myself missing them, the way things could have been. But then I remembered, those parents, the ones I missed, had never truly existed. They had been replaced long ago by entitlement and greed. I wasn't mourning them anymore. I was mourning the illusion. On the anniversary of the verdict, I invited my closest friends over for dinner. We ate, laughed, and toasted to resilience. As the night wound down, I stood at the doorway, watching them leave, my heart full. I closed the door, turned around, and looked at the home I had fought so hard to keep. For the first time, I whispered aloud, I won. Not just the court case, not just the house, but my freedom. My peace, my future. My parents had taken me to court for daring to build a life, but in the end, I walked away with something far greater than a house. I walked away with myself, whole, unshaken, and finally free.